And I want to talk about how I use this book with kids and how other people might use this book with kids and how maybe you could use this book with kids so that we can do stuff. I'm going to skip that. But here, so how we can live. Karen and I worked on it together. And we worked on it. Karen is the illustrator. She made all these beautiful pictures. And I also want to say that how we can live, in case you've only used the activity book, Karen made new artwork for how we can live. I'm really excited about it. And it's gorgeous. So some of it is the same. Some of it is the posters that you might have. And some of it is new. So this first book happened for probably like three big things have to happen for the first book to happen. Karen and I worked together. We were thinking about how to make sure that kids could engage with the principles of Black Lives Matter at school. We thought of a activity book. When I first went to my first Black Lives at School organizing meeting, I was like, oh, these principles make total sense. I'm going to translate them into kid-friendly language so that early childhood teachers have some language to use this with kids. Great. This is actually how we run our classrooms. So that happened. And then in March 2020, New York City went into lockdown. I did not go on vacation. I instead stayed home and wept. And then I learned how to teach kids on Zoom. Luckily, I had met all of those kids before I'd been working with them. Our relationships happened. And then George Floyd was murdered. And I got some emails from parents that said, my kid really wants to talk to you about this, but they don't want to scare other kids. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, you know, if we were in school, this is a conversation we would be having. We are all collectively traumatized by the United States and now also by this pandemic. And gosh, everything is hard. And so I met with my team. I had a team of 3 other amazing kindergarten teachers, and we all taught all the kindergartners together, and we thought about what to do. And normally we'd have a community meeting, but we were not in school. And so what we decided is that we would have a meeting for our kids and our kids' grownups. And we sent grownups an email saying, this is when this meeting's going to happen. It's going to be on Zoom. You are absolutely welcome to come with your child. This is going to be a conversation where we process with kids about what has happened. This is not going to be the time where we explain to kids what has happened. So if you and your family have already talked about what has happened, please feel free to come. If your family has not and you want to talk about it before you come, that's okay too. But this is not going to be the part where teachers tell kids about how adults are horrible to other people. And so we had a meeting with 5 and 6-year-olds. And kids shared what they knew. They shared how they were feeling. We talked about what had happened. We talked about how we could help ourselves to feel safe. We talked about how we could make the world be a safer place. I was very fortunately at a school. We had already discussed activism. We'd already discussed Black Lives Matter. We were already doing these things, and I knew I was supported. And then a kid said, how did all of this even start? And this is what happened. I still cry every time I tell the story because it's so upsetting. And I thought, oh, like that is the question, right? How did this start? And kids are appalled. They want to know, why is this happening? And so I had a moment and I said to the kids, I'm having really big feelings. I feel really sad right now. But I want to answer your question because it's such an important question. And I said, this started because of a story. There's a story that white people are better than Black people. And some people have told this story for so long that people believe it. And this is what happens when people believe these kinds of stories. And the kid was like, that's a dumb story. And I was like, you are right. And all the kids were like, this is ridiculous, because it is. When you think about it, it is. We've all learned to accept it. And sometimes we have to, because otherwise we would just spend all day crying, which is not, which is like, doesn't feel good to spend all day crying. And one of the things that Key Gross talks about is how we don't let kids sit in their trauma. We move to action, right? And so kids were like, we have to tell better stories because those stories are like, this story is bad and it's not true and it's not fair, but the stories where everybody deserves to live and everybody should have all the things they need, those are true stories. That's real. And I was like, yes, well done, kids, because that's the thing, right? Where kids give me the inspiration to not sink into despair. So we talked a little bit more, and then our call ended. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I fully just cried in front of all of my children's parents. They're all going to be like, gosh, Laleña. Oh, and then one of my kids was like, my mom's having big feelings over there. And I was like, yeah, grown-ups have big feelings. This is a big deal. We're really disappointed. This makes us sad. And I got several emails afterwards that were not like, gosh, you're so unprofessional. You've cried in front of children. Now you've traumatized them. I got a whole bunch of emails that were, thank you for sharing your feelings. Thank you for feeling vulnerable. Thank you for modeling for me how to talk to my child, how to have my feelings so that they know this is a big deal. This is what makes grown-ups cry, because it's so upsetting. And when we act as though it's not a big deal, then that's the story we're telling them. That's a message that we're sending. And the same way that we might cry when someone in our family dies, and that is okay for kids to know, but we don't cry when like our toast is burned. This actually helps people to know what's a big deal and what's not, because children are learning that. And if Black people getting murdered is the same as our toast getting burned, then we end up with the country we have. And I think we can do better. And luckily, all these principles are like, hi, we have a blueprint for a better society. So that happened. And also what happened is that a friend of mine, Kyle Lukoff, who wrote this amazing book, When Aiden Became a Brother, stopped by my house to show me his new books. And I got some new books, and he said, what's going on with your coloring book? And I said, oh, it's a coloring book. I couldn't write a children's book. It's too hard. Like writing a book with a story about the principles like that that's not what I have the skill to do. And he's like, oh, let me see it. And he's like, oh, this is great. I can't make any promises, but can I bring this to my editor? And I was like, sure. So I hand him a photocopied thing from Park Slope printing, and he goes off, and I go back inside to like get on the internet and watch all my children's seesaws and do all the terrible things that happened when we were teaching online. And 5 days later, I got a phone call from an editor who said, we're interested in your book. We've never published a coloring book. And it was Lee and Low, which is a company that I deeply respect and have for many years. And I said, okay, I would love to write this book, but there are some things that I really want to be part of it. I said, number one is I want to have a letter to kids, and I want to talk to kids about stories and systems. That needs to be there. Because in the US, we love to pretend that all oppression is interpersonal. We love to pretend that as long as everyone is kind and no boys are ever mean to girls, there's no sexism. And no white people are ever mean to Black people, there's no racism. But there's institutionalized racism and sexism and homophobia and all of these things that are not going to be fixed by us all being kind. Being kind is baseline. But we have to, in order to change systems, we have to change systems. And she said, sure. And I said, I feel like I want to maybe later on write something that involves some history, because like Steve Fletcher just said, like, we need to abolish the police in Minneapolis. Like, things are happening. I don't know what's going to happen. And I want to maybe do that. And she said, yeah, let's talk about that. And I ended up with a contract that like covered this book, the activity book, which I think some of you might have used, and like an option for later on, which is pretty exciting, because now there's a huge backlash right now. But the reason there's a backlash is because we got cops out of schools in a lot of places. That's a big deal. That is one of the 4 demands of Black Lives Matter at school. And the reason right now we are seeing trans kids under attack and we are seeing the teaching of history under attack is because it is working. What we are doing is powerful. And so it is scary right now. And that lets us know that what we have been doing for the last, 5 or 6 years of Black Lives Matter at school is working. It's happening. kids are really thinking, and those kids are going to grow up and do stuff. And some of them are doing stuff right now. And I think that's what is so important about teaching kids. It's not about like, you're going to grow up and vote. It's like, right now, what are you doing? And do you feel like you have the right and the responsibility to make the world a better place? And that is what that's what I want to do all day long for kids, is that like, you have the right and the responsibility to make our community the best it can be. And, you know, these principles happen to be kind of perfect for that. Like, this is the world I want to live in. As this one says, like, kids know about power. Like, who knows more about power than a person who doesn't have a whole lot, right? Like, we tell kids what to do all day long. Like, they have to go to school. They have to get up. They have to get dressed. They may or may not have choices about what they wear. I teach 5-year-olds. They have to like get to a place, and then they're in school and teachers are like, you need to sit down, which is, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, because sometimes we do need to sit down. We say, oh, we have to listen to each other's voices. That's true, we do. We may or may not explain to them why. I think we should, because one of my kids said, well, if we all talked at once, it would be like a traffic jam. We wouldn't hear anyone. And that is one of my new favorite similes. But they know about power. And so when they see it in the world, when a 3-year-old says, Mommy, why are all the homeless people brown? She's not being racist. She's observing racism being enacted. And kids notice these things. And we can either talk to them about it, or we can choose not to. And if we choose not to, what they hear is, that's just how it is. And when what you hear is, that's just how it is, what you're also hearing is, that's how it should be. And if that's what we want, then like, that's what we have right now. You can decide whether or not you like it. I'm assuming that since you're here, you don't like it. So you have to think of other things to do. So I'm gonna do this. It is really important that we're honest with our young people. We acknowledge the reality of racialized violence. This does not mean you have to show your children videos of Black people being murdered, right? Like, when people show those kinds of things and other people say, gosh, like, that is when I like really understood that something was wrong. That's on that person's soul. Like, if you need to watch someone being murdered to know that it's not okay, probably you should go sit quietly and think about that some. But our kids already know that. But we can tell them in an age-appropriate way about things that happen, and we can offer them the alternatives. And that's what's really important. So here's the action. This is what you do. So you're not just sitting in the trauma of terrible things happen. You're thinking, oh, terrible things don't have to happen. We can tell different stories. And when I hear a kid say, well, anyone can sing, girls, boys, non-binary people, everyone with a voice. That's a conversation that I had, 20 years ago with a kid being like, oh, a girl said, like, someone said girls can't do this. And I said girls or boys could do this. But last year, this kid just mentioned non-binary people, same breath. That's the story that kid has in their head and just comes out of their mouth. So they're practicing, we have to help them practice. And also remember that kids will have really good ideas. And as adults, we're always like, no, we couldn't, but don't do that. That's like what people do to us if we're abolitionists. We're like, maybe we don't need to put people in cages. And someone says, but what about, like, we're not listening to that. We're not thinking about the lowest possible worst thing that could happen. We're thinking about what we want for all people. And as an early childhood educator, I spend a lot of time telling kids what I want them to do, not what I don't want them to do. And so we can do that. And that's why these principles are so important, because I want to live in a world that's queer affirming. I want to live in a world where there's restorative justice. I want to live in a world where we practice loving engagement. That sounds great to me. And a thing that's important, because people say, Black Lives Matter is about police brutality. That's terrifying. And yes, police brutality is terrifying. It is like the movement that we are thinking about was founded in response to that. But Black people's lives are not about white supremacy and never have been. And I was just talking with Mimi about Reconstruction and the ways that we don't learn history and the ways that we learn it through certain lenses. But it's really important to know that when we are thinking about the principles of Black Lives Matter, we are thinking about affirmative actions to take and ways we would like to live. And that's not scary for kids of any age. It's not scary to be like, oh, we have to take responsibility for our actions, or we really need to listen to everyone's ideas, or it's really important that if you hurt another person, you're able to help them. And that we also think of that as what it does for the person who has harmed someone else. Because we often think of restorative justice as being really good for the kid who's been harmed, but it's also really good for the kid who is harmed, because children start off not wanting to hurt other people. And then the world might teach them other lessons and tell them some other stories. But if we keep teaching them the story that it feels good to take care of other people, then our world is going to be different. So I'm gonna drink some water. And I want to talk just a little bit about some ideas that I had when I wrote this book. And I ended it with a quote from Ursula Le Guin, which says, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And one of the things that I say to kids that's so important, that I think we all should remind ourselves to, is that what's happening now is not inevitable. It is not facts. White supremacy is not a fact in terms of like the stories that it tells. Those are not facts. It is a story that people have told. And there are systems, which are the practices and what do I say? So systems are the ways that it's like the rules and practices that we put in place to get people to believe the stories we've told and to get them to tell the same stories. That's how I explain it to kids. And at its essence, that's kind of how these systems work, right? Like when we think about redlining, like that is a system, that's some rules and some practices that are put in place to support the story of white supremacy, to support the story that Black people are not responsible landowners, to support the story that Black people can't be trusted, to support the story that Black people are lazy and shouldn't have access to wealth. So that's a system. So what we need to do is create new systems and new stories. And the thing about all of these systems that are super harmful is that they were created and put into place by people, which means that other people can create and put into place new systems. And we may not know what all those systems are yet, but we can think about them. And a thing that was important to me when I wrote this, so there's the beginning. This is not a book to read all at once to your class, no matter who they are, of any age. But this is a book that you can use with very young children and older kids and high schoolers. So at the beginning, I have a little bit that's just about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it talks about systems and how they're invisible and how we don't really think about them, but we have to do something about it. And then at the end, this is something that was important to me. They gave me many pages because I couldn't cut it down. There's this whole thing for adults, an afterword for adults. All these pages, gosh. And one of the things that I think is really important for adults is that we use our imaginations and like really use them, and don't let your adult brain be like, oh, no, that couldn't happen, right? So what might our society look like if we emphasize community and compassion rather than competition? Like, I imagine it would look a little different. I imagine that I can't imagine all the things that would be different, but I think it's worth trying. You know, what would change for the world if Black humanity was recognized? And I think this is really important because when we think about backlash, people are imagining terrifying things, right? When people talk about like, oh my God, what if we allow children to talk about their gender in the way that they want, and then they just change their pronouns every day? Okay, what if they do that? Like, let's go with that. Then what happens? I mean, nothing, right? Like actually nothing. But people tell terrified, like, oh, then the bathrooms will all be like, shut up. But like really let people like use your imaginations and follow things through, right? Because that's something that's really important and kids are super good at it. And some people are telling horrifying stories. And I think that one thing that's so important about these principles is it gives people some idea of what might be imagined. And what is imagined is not Black people doing to white people what was done to us. As Toni Morrison said, that's your disease. That's your problem. That's not what we want. And of course, it's terrifying. Like when white people look around and see like what has happened to Black people over the years, like that's horrifying. And there is this idea that maybe someone will do that back. Or maybe the idea is like, if you have power, that's how you have to act. There's nothing else that you can do. And so either you are like oppressing or being oppressed, like eat or be eaten. Maybe there are some other options. And helping people realize that, I think, is one of the things that may or may not help people let go. Like some people just want their power and want to keep it. And I'm sorry about that. That makes me sad. And there are people who are honestly afraid and aren't able to use their imaginations. And I think that's one of the reasons why children are powerful, because it's really hard to look at a 5-year-old who says, why doesn't everybody have a home? And be like, well, not everybody deserves a home. Like that's hard. And as adults, we do a lot of mental gymnastics. So I want us to ask ourselves these questions. And I'm gonna, hang on, I'm gonna go back. Can I do this? Yeah. All right. There's a thing I'm gonna share in the chat. It's kind of a group journaling exercise. And actually, Mimi, could you stick that in the chat for me? Thank you. And thinking about our imaginations and what do we think might happen if any of these principles came to their conclusions. If you have the book like hanging out and you want to look at it and choose one, that's great. Karen and I, when we were thinking about this together, I don't know if I can do this, thought of a few different ones. Just thinking about like knowing about power, or being honest with kids, or the framework for a more just society. There's little boxes there so that everybody can have their own box and write about it. I'm going to move this back up just because that way everyone can see it. But pick a box, think about one of these things or something else that you're thinking about, and just let yourself do some imagining. I feel like as grown-ups, we spend a lot of time doing what we think we're supposed to do, and then like relaxing from those things, and then also doing what we think is like a really necessary thing because we're teachers and we're working a lot. So right now, what I'm telling you to do is use your imagination. So you have permission right now to stop and think and use your imagination. And it's part of professional development, and you're with a bunch of people who are also interested in hearing your ideas. So folks could, we're gonna take, I'm gonna say 3 thinking minutes to type away about any of your responses to any of these ideas, like kids knowing about power, being honest with them, and then like what would happen if we use these guiding principles to live our lives, just so that people can, just so that we get some chance. One of the things I say to kids is that our imaginations are rusty. Kids have really good imaginations. Like my kids will do things like, here's a block building of a farm that has all animals and no farmer, because the animals didn't want to be kept in cages. They just wanted to be. And sometimes as adults, we're like, oh, but like they would all run away. No, just do some imagining so that we can get some of the rust off our imaginations and think about the world that we want to live in. So there we go. Thank you. I'm gonna stop talking so you all can focus. One of the reasons that I think things like this are so important is so that we can create a caring community together. Like, I don't know most of you, but when I read this, I am inspired to be a better teacher and to like not sit at home and cry all the time because the world is a terrible place. And teaching can be super isolating, especially if we're not supported at our schools. And so I think that the community that can be built at things like this are just so important. All of this, I am inspired. And yeah, kids do get emotional. I'm just kind of scrolling through, but you all can scroll through on your own. And there's something that I'm thinking about this, about courageous conversations with kids and the ways that we do that. Like, one thing I'm forever talking to grownups about is that adult discomfort is not the same as child discomfort. And so when kids talk about their identity, it's not upsetting to them until we teach them that it's upsetting. It's upsetting to us because we weren't allowed to do it. We don't have a lot of practice. We have to keep practicing. And it's important for us to tell kids that. Like, sometimes I say to kids, like, oh, here's a book. It has a little black girl in it playing with a dragon. And I love it because I didn't have those books when I was a kid. And they're all like, what? That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, great. Yeah. But just remembering that sometimes things are hard for us. And this is something to also remind grownups and families and other people about, is that it's hard for us because we've learned something else. If kids learn it now, it won't be hard for them because they'll have practiced. Right? We don't necessarily teach math the way we were taught. We don't necessarily teach reading the way we were taught. We shouldn't teach race and gender and family and class the way we were taught, unless we were taught really well. But probably we weren't. Probably had to do some unlearning. Unlearning is hard. It's really important. I know a teacher who teaches 3s, 4s, and 5s at a forest school, and her class rules, like her class norms, are based on the guiding principles, which is actually not that hard a step because all of these are how early childhood people want to run their classrooms. And a lot of people teach other ages too. So thank you for sharing all of these. This is wonderful. I hope that this was helpful for you all to see all of your compatriots wanting to think about these things. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. Thank you for the ways that we need to teach everyone stories. It's actually funny, this one at the top, children have an innate sense of justice. I see this in my kindergarten students all the time. I didn't see like the end of the quote, and I was like, oh yeah, that's how I think. And I was like, oh no, this is somebody else having the same idea. Because we want our kids to take care of each other. And we want our kids to live in a world that's safe for them and everyone else. And we also want, and this is something that I think gets left out, when people hurt other people, it doesn't feel good to them. When people take care of other people, it does feel good to them. And so one of the things I think about, that I've actually thought about since I was a kid, is like, when we say this is how we treat everybody and hold people accountable and make sure that everyone practices being kind and taking care of each other and taking responsibility, that's not just for people who get hurt. That's for people who hurt other people. Like, if you have a kid who's hitting other kids and you let them, what they are learning is that, oh my gosh, school is a place where people can get hit. I better hit people before they hit me. If you have a kid who's hitting other kids and you don't let them, and you say that's not okay, school is a place where kids and teachers need to be safe, then it is easier for them to learn that. Probably if you have a kid who's hitting other kids a lot, there's other things going on. I don't want to ignore that. And some of those things that are going on is the violence of white supremacy and capitalism. So that's another thing. But we have to acknowledge that and realize that this is for everyone. And when someone says, will a child feel upset because it's Black Lives Matter and not another group of people, the answer is no. That is not how children think. That is a rhetorical device employed by adults. So don't worry about that. All right, now I want to go back to my slideshow because there were a few other things I wanted to say. but I will only be able to go back to my slideshow if I can figure out technology. Oh, there it is. So I'm sharing. Oh, I just wanted to show this picture. Oh no, that's not the picture I wanted to share. That's something else. Guess what? I don't know how to go back. Maybe I do. Oh, look at that. I just wanted to share this picture because it makes me so happy. This is new for the hardcover. Ah! Apologies for my, there we go. Thank you. Apologies for my technological ineptitude. If I had a chart paper and a book, I would be more comfortable because that's what I practice. But this picture is not a picture that I think a lot of people see when we talk about Black people. Technology is nobody's friend, it's true. But just thinking about what we have, what we offer, do we have a whole bunch of books that are all about Black trauma? Can we not? Can we have some books about Black people living their lives and doing this? Like, look at this, look at these people, look how happy these people are. Black people can be happy in this world. Trans people, like my friend Kyle wrote when Aiden became his brother, he was like, it's a book about a trans kid and nothing bad happens to him because he's trans. I'm like, yeah, that's what we need. That's really important. So those are some things that I just want people to think about and know about. Here's just a picture of me. This is before the book. This is before the pandemic. I actually saw these kids right here. I saw them on Monday at my old school's Martin Luther King Day March. And this kid in the stripy shirt in the front has a quote that I use all the time when I talk to grown-ups, and his twin sister is sitting behind him, and she's wearing like a unicorn dress. And I saw them and they are so big now. They're all like grown up. But this is me talking to them when they were in kindergarten, and we were talking about the week of action. We talked about the demands, about how an activist needs to have something that they want. They can't just say what they don't want, same way as teachers. And kids say great things, and probably you all hear because you all already know about the amazing things that kids say when we give them space. And it's hard to find that time and space. I know that that's something I'm struggling with right now, even as we speak. I'm like redoing my schedule and my planner because I can't. I'm like, I don't have time to do all the things. What's cutting out? And also just thinking about the ways that we teach, not just what we teach and how long we teach it, right? So we can't just say, all right, it's the 21st, so we're gonna like have our week of action in February and then we're done. Every year around this, actually usually like a little bit later, I get a bunch of emails like, Laleña, the Black Lives Matter at School week of action is coming. Can you come do this thing or like write me a thing or do something? And I'm like, I'm overwhelmed. And then I like eventually get to it like mid-February or sometimes March. Yes, I'm going to talk about that. Thank you. And I don't hear back from these people. And I'm like, oh, I see that Black Lives mattered for 5 days, but this needs to happen all year. And if you start talking about it in April, that's better than not doing it at all. And I keep the posters up in my room all year. Here, like let's talk about that. Right. So this is a question. Tips for introducing it to early elementary, K-3. So the first thing I do is I sit down with one of my books because I have books. And we do a KWL, just like we do for a lot of things. Like, have you ever heard the words Black Lives Matter? And kids are like, yes or no. What do you know about these words? Black Lives Matter is a group of people who are working to make sure the world is fair. Because sometimes the world isn't fair. You might have learned about Martin Luther King. He lived a long time ago. Things are still not fair. That's a really important thing, right? It's not like, oh, Martin Luther King is like one guy who changed a bunch of stuff and now it's all better. Not true. Also, doesn't help. And Key Gross of Woke Kindergarten has an amazing little 60-second clip that introduces a lot of Black women who worked with and inspired and supported Dr. King before and during and after his career. And that's something that I haven't shown because I couldn't get the technology to work, but I'm gonna. And then I will read some books, learn about other people and how we work together. But so I sit down, I'm like, what do you know? And then I show them one of the posters and I read them a poster, and they're all written in my talking to kids voice. And so kids don't always know that I'm reading it to them. They think I'm just talking to them. And then I say, okay, we're going to read a book about this. And then I put this poster in our classroom so you can see it all year long. And then we'll talk about it as the year goes on. And so what will happen, actually, this is where I have to go. This is what happened the year I taught on Zoom. What do you know about Black Lives Matter? One time we were going out in the street, it was blacked out on the street, it said Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter means that people with black skin and white skin can do things together. So these are Zoom kids. These are children that I never met in person. I met 2 of them in person on Monday for the first time, 2 years after I taught them. And the love I got from them was actually really special. But so this is what kids might say. This is what my kids said one year. This year, my kids said a lot less. I'm at a different school. They're a little bit younger. It's also not 2021, right? So things happen. Sorry, I'm going to go back. Can I go back? Yeah. So for young kids, what do you know? And I show them a poster and we talk about what do we know? And we make sure that it doesn't just happen once, and kids will reference posters all year long. They're like, oh, this reminds me of this because of whatever. Or this book reminds me of this other thing. And later on, I have a whole thing about early childhood. So you should come to that because that's where I'm going to go through the whole thing. And you'll even see these slides probably. But so that is how I do it. And I think it's just letting kids know, but come to the other one, because that's specifically for early childhood. And the thing I'm going to say before I go, or before I take a few more questions, because I have 5 minutes, is that this book in particular is not a one-time thing. This is a 17 times thing. It is too long. The intro is long even for 3rd or 4th or 5th graders. I think it's useful. And I think it's important that we talk to kids about, good readers go back to books that they've already read, which is probably something that you also say about other books. But it's an ongoing conversation. And it needs to show up in the ways that we teach, and thinking about, there are definitely times when I've heard a kid say, I think some restorative justice, because they're someone has knocked over someone else's block building and needs to help them rebuild it. And that's important. So use the terms in your daily lives, think about them in all the moments. And one of the things that I do when I think about power in my class is notice when I'm exercising it and see if there's times when I can give it up. The other day, we have a job called the Goodbye Rhyme Helper, and one of my kids in my class moved to Connecticut. So now we have too many jobs and not enough kids. And my associate and I are we don't really like the Goodbye Rhyme. Let's just get rid of it and put it into this other thing. We'll make the news of the day helper that person. And one of my kids was and I was friend, I see you have feelings. What's going on? And she said, well, some kids really like doing news of the day. And it seems that it wouldn't be fair if we only got to do it when it was our turn. When it was our turn, we had to wait all that time. And I was oh, well, that makes sense. So let's think about that as a community, because we made our job chart as a community. And yeah, should I be going around making executive decisions? No. There are some things I have to be a benevolent dictator about, but there are times when I can really let that go. So that's the ongoing thing. And do I think they should celebrate Black History Month? I think it's totally legitimate to celebrate Black History Month as I don't want to say as a historical artifact, but hey, right now, people are having Black History Month. Why do you think that? Why do you think people wanted Black History Month? Was Black history being taught? What did people do about it? Do we think that do you think we should only learn about Black history now? Or should we learn about it all year long? Why should we learn about it all year long? Oh, what might make people feel the need to definitely have a Black History Month? Is it because, does that make them get some attention and some is better than none? Have this conversation with your kids, because that is what I think leads to the critical thinking, because it doesn't feel good to kids to be tokenized. It doesn't feel great to kids to have Women's History Month or whatever. If you're just okay, we're doing this now and now we're not, because then they don't have any say and they don't have any context, but give them context. I think that's really, really important. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the ways in which history has some people try to do a thing to fix the problem. Hey, is this fix the problem? No, why not? How do we do it? It doesn't mean that people weren't trying to fix a legitimate problem. It doesn't even mean that it's not a legitimate solution at that time to this problem. What do we know? And also, what do we know about making sure that I think that sometimes it's like, well, no one ever taught any Black history ever. And so it was better to have a month. But do you think we could get better than that? Like, what can we do? Because I think sometimes there's just like, what? They only asked for that. Well, that's all they could get. And I'm not saying that we need to only think about what we can get, but sometimes that is the reality. And having kids acknowledge that and know that, like to know that there are people fighting against it, that there are people with power making decisions, actively trying to not do this, I think is important for kids to know. We can't just be like, bad things were bad things happened. Passive voice was used. No, people made choices. People did things. And so people did other things in response. How do we fix it? So yes, and it's not 2021. People, I don't get as many random emails from random folks I don't know. That's okay, but it's a thing that I've noticed. It's 12:54. Thank you all so much. I hope that this was helpful and that it was just informative and just like how these books happened, how you can use them. I hope that you do. Please make sure that you use them in whatever way feels really good to you and to your kids, and see how you can just make space for this all the time. It's so hard. There's so much going on and it's so rewarding. And when kids feel seen and heard in these kinds of ways, it also helps out with things like classroom management and other times, right? Like when I let my kids make decisions about some things and I'm like, all right, now I have to do handwriting, it is definitely boring. I have more buy-in because they know that I care about them. And I think that's something that we all could use a little more of in our lives. Whew. So thank you all so much.